Okay, I think everyone's in, and we'll be maybe a few more sort of filtering in over the next few minutes. Welcome, firstly. This is another part of the series of bite-sized broadcasts that Red Loft are producing. I'm joined today by Luke Raistrick of Centro Planning Consultancy, and we're going to be talking about planning principally, planning updates related to housing delivery and specifically about affordable housing and viability. We've called that the direction of travel, but really we're looking at the intentions of the new Labour government. So welcome, Luke, and we'll get started.
Thank you for having me.
A little bit about your presenters, who we are. My name is Rob Bloss. I'm Assistant Director, Land and Viability at Red Loft. I'm a chartered surveyor specialising in affordable housing and viability, and I've been working at Red Loft for about 10 years now. In a viability context, that's on behalf of local planning authorities and applicants as well in assessing financial viability. I'll hand you over to Luke for a bit of an intro.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So I'm Luke Raistrick, founder and managing director of Centro Planning Consultancy. I'm a chartered town planner, specialising in residential development in Greater London, and I've been practising since 2007 and launched Centro in 2019.
Great, thank you, Luke. So some areas of discussion for today. Like I said, we're looking at the government direction of travel for planning. And within that, we're going to be looking at the NPPF proposed changes and consultation. Specifically within those, it's an examination of the changes to viability and planning and what the implications might be of these changes for affordable housing and affordable housing delivery. We'll wrap up with a little bit of what we would like to see in terms of implemented changes. And I think that'd be a neat point to take any questions in the chat for discussion if there's anything you think of during the presentation. Okay. So an obligatory slide on who we are, Red Loft. Hopefully most people will know us. Obviously from contact list, etc. But we're an affordable housing consultancy, and we advise clients in the public and private sectors, have been doing so for about 20 years. There's a team of over 60 people, and it's all centred around enabling the delivery of quality affordable homes. The sort of directorates are land, development and sales. The expertise in financial viability is what my team provides, and we've got a lot of clients both on the private and public side, as shown in the diagram here. Luke, let's go.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, Centro, we're a town planning practice, and as it says there, we advise both private developers but also local authorities. We're based in central London, Farringdon. We're a team of 8. And our focus primarily is Greater London. Most of the work we do is residential, although we do branch out into visitor accommodation, and on the odd occasion we get involved in a bit of professional sports as well. And there's just a small selection there of some of the projects successes that we've had over the last few years.
Great, thank you, Luke. So we'll start with sort of planning direction of travel, and I'll leave it to Luke to kind of set the scene, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So most people on this call will be aware that there's a new NPPF coming, and that consultation into that recently closed. What maybe less of you know is that there was actually a ministerial statement that was put out by Angela Rayner MP, who is the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government. And that was put out on the same day that the draft NPPF went out for consultation. And for those of you that haven't read it, I'd certainly encourage you to do so. It's a really good, but not very long statement, but really, really dense with information, providing an understanding of where the government's looking to take things around planning and viability as well. And it's titled "Building the Homes We Need," so it gives you an understanding of broadly where the government's going with this. And what you'll see there, I've just picked out a couple of the really key paragraphs from the introduction, and it talks about the fact that we're in the middle of the most acute housing crisis in living memory. But what is also interesting is it talks about the need to boost the number of homes for ownership, also the private rental market, and then it also talks about a safe and secure home, and it's talking about affordable housing particularly there. So it's talking about housing across all of the various sectors, and the 1.5 million homes that the government has committed to deliver over the next 5 years. I'm sure everybody has seen that in the press at some stage over the last 4 or 5 months. And what that written ministerial statement does is it picks out 7 key themes. 6 of them I've picked out for the purposes of this discussion. So you'll see they're restoring and raising housing targets, building in the right places, moving to strategic planning, delivering more affordable housing, supporting local planning, and finally the first step of a bigger plan. So what we'll do is we'll unpack each of those themes so you can get a better understanding. So starting with restoring and raising housing targets, there's certainly under the last government, there was a relaxation in terms of local authorities being able to set their own housing targets to some extent following the abolition of regional government. And what this government's seeking to do is provide much more in the way of top-down setting of housing targets. There's a feeling that a lot of these local authorities have been not getting on and delivering the homes that they need. So central government trying to take back more control in that respect. And one of the tools that the government is seeking to implement through the NPPF is a new standard method for generating housing targets. And it's much more affordability driven. That is, from the research we've seen, throwing out a few anomalies, particularly in central London, where you've got really, really high house prices at the moment. Kensington and Chelsea being a good example of that. But yeah, in terms of affordability, I think that's a sensible way forward. If you add up what the government's trying to achieve nationally, the total figure is 370,000 homes per year, which if you multiply that by 5 being the number of years of the government tenure that we expect, you'll see you get to a figure of 1.85 million homes. That is, of course, more than the 1.5 that they've committed to, and I think that's more to do with the fact that not every even if you target 1.85 homes and that target isn't met, they're still meeting that headline 1.5 million that they'd set. And then in terms of Greater London, as things stand at the moment, the London plan has a target of 52,000 homes a year, compared to an objectively assessed need of 66,000 homes per year, but looking to uplift that to 80,000 homes. So quite a significant uplift. Not least considering that we've not hit anything like those London plan targets that have been set for a long time now. So yeah, lots will need to be done to get to 80,000 homes per year. Sorry. Second, building in the right places. Well, every new local government that comes in makes some kind of pledge around the need to deliver more housing on brownfield land, and the way that this government has couched that is to say that the default answer to brownfield development should be yes. I think everybody would agree with that, but in fact how that gets implemented in practice is another question altogether. Brownfield development being far more complicated, of course. There's a strengthened expectation that local plans should promote an uplift in density in urban areas, and that's certainly welcome policy as far as we're concerned. Far too often we find local authorities are nervous about consenting residential development, which is much taller than the surrounding area, but it's what we have to do if we're going to hit the sorts of numbers that we need to hit. And then finally, this new concept of grey belt, which everybody will have heard of through the press, and recognizing that not all greenbelt land needs to be as strictly protected as it has been in the past, and recognizing that on previously developed land on the edge of existing settlements or roads, the sort of land with little aesthetic or environmental value, well, why shouldn't we release that land, and why shouldn't we treat that land differently to what people imagine when they think of green belt? So yeah, much more ad hoc release of grey belt land, and Rob will touch upon that later in terms of what that means around affordable housing too. Third, moving to strategic planning. Those of us that practice within the Greater London area will know that Greater London is unique in that there's two tiers of planning at local and regional level, and the GLA has a role both in terms of the authors of the London plan, but also as a decision-making body too on the largest developments. And I think unequivocally the role that the GLA has been successful as a strategic planning body, and it would seem that the government has acknowledged that and feels like that's a good model to perhaps roll out over other large city areas where you've got multiple local authorities, and there's just that need for an overarching approach, particularly to drive to the delivery of more housing and affordable housing. So turning to delivering more affordable housing, well, the government has said that it's committed to the biggest growth in social and affordable house building in a generation. They talk about affordable housing, but we know that it's social rented housing in particular, that's their main focus. And you'll see there from that second point that we actually have fewer social rented homes today than we did 10 years ago, particularly around right to buy. And there's been lots of stuff in the press at the moment, hasn't there, about trying to potentially remove that or restrict it in some way. But also even the money that has been put up to deliver affordable housing in the recent past, a lot of it has become bottlenecked for various reasons. And you'll see there, even though there's money to be able to deliver in theory 180,000 homes per year, we're not delivering anything like that amount of affordable housing at the moment. Yeah. Supporting local planning. So one of the negative consequences that we've certainly found over the previous government tenure is, and this is particularly so in greenbelt or locations, that local authorities just aren't getting fit for purpose local plans in place quick enough. And planning, of course, is supposed to be a plan-led system, that local authorities are supposed to allocate enough land to deliver the homes that we need, and then those homes then get delivered. Unfortunately, far too many of these greenbelt authorities in particular arguably have had too much control in terms of setting housing targets, but also the speed at which they bring forward local plans. But also they've been able to lean on the fact that there's been so much change in national policy over the last few years that as they've been moving through the plan production, it's allowed them to take one step forward, well, two steps forward, one step back each time, just as this constant change in national policy has come through. What Angela Rayner has directed to the planning inspectorate who examine local plans is, whereas in the past inspectors have perhaps overstepped their role in taking half or three-quarter baked local plans and working really hard with local authorities to try and get those plans into a place where they can be found sound. Unlike that, now the instruction to the planning inspectorate is, look, unless the draft local plan that you see in the first instance is within touching distance of being sound, don't even entertain it. Just hand it straight back to the local authority and tell them they need to try harder. And then finally, there's a renewed threat from central government that if you don't get on and allocate land and adopt local plans will do that job for you, albeit, that would be an extremely draconian step and not one that we've seen in the past to date.
Interesting if that materialises.
So the NPPF is the proposed changes to the NPPF are just the first step of a bigger plan, apparently, and the government is looking to bring forward new statute next year. So we're expecting a planning and infrastructure bill to come through next year, and part of that will be to modernise planning committees, trying to reduce the number of applications that go to planning committees, and particularly for smaller developments, allowing planning officers to just get on and make those decisions that they're qualified to make, enabling local authorities to put their planning departments on a more sustainable financial footing as well. And there's talk of local setting of planning application fees, which I don't think any developer would object to, so long as they are getting the service and getting the response times and ultimately getting the decisions in the in the time frames that these things can be achieved in if they're properly resourced. And then finally, there's been some mention of revision to the compulsory purchase rules, whereas at the moment some hope value can be taken into account when compulsory purchase compensation is being negotiated. There's talk about trying to remove that hope value, which again is an interesting development, particularly for those landowners that have already spent considerable sums on land with the intention of developing it themselves. Finally, new towns. There's been lots in the press recently, hasn't there, about this new wave of new towns that Angela Rayner feels is absolutely essential in order to deliver that 1.5 million homes. We're not going to be able to do this just through urban extensions and brownfield development. We need to be thinking about, large new settlements, which again is an interesting concept, and one which, I'm sure we'll all watch very, very carefully.
Yeah, the more comprehensive development. Thanks, Luke. There's obviously a lot in there, and probably a lot that reflects what sort of industry bodies have been calling for a lot of years. So it'd be interesting to see how it comes into effect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's proposed in terms of viability, which isn't a vast amount, to be honest, in terms of changes. But before we go into that, we'll just talk about some of the high-level principles, so we're on the right page. I didn't want to go through another sort of technical presentation on like methodology, application of development viability, but for context, it's good to brush over, I think, the core principles before looking at the changes that have been proposed. So viability is principally discussed in two contexts. You've got assessing the financial performance of development proposals, like how profitable a scheme might be. And secondly, you've got assessing the ability of development to deliver planning obligations, including the provision of affordable housing. So that's in the specific planning setting, either at the plan making stage or at the decision taking stage. So that's linked specifically to a detailed planning application. And in the context of changes to the planning system, we're principally talking about the second of these, obviously. Viability is inherently an objective assessment of development viability, because permissions stay with the land rather than with applicants. And the purpose of this objective assessment, according to the PPG, is to ensure policies are realistic, i.e. around planning obligations, and that the total cumulative costs of all development, of all policies, won't undermine deliverability. So it's intended to promote sustainable development and delivery. So that's the lens through which we'll talk about these proposed changes. I've flashed up the relevant policy and guidance, but obviously what we're talking about here is the proposed changes to the National Planning Policy Framework. And broadly, in terms of methodology, underpinning viability assessment is the methodology shown here, where the total costs of delivering a development or a scheme are deducted from the total value, the gross development value. And the output of this is a residual output, either a land value or a profit. And this is compared with what's known as the benchmark land value or the benchmark profit. In this context, it's most helpful to talk about comparison with the benchmark land value. In high level terms, if the scheme generates a higher land value, residual land value to the benchmark, then it's considered viable. And it shows that by granting planning permission for a scheme, that there has been a land value uplift, and the scheme can technically deliver some of these contributions that are set in policy terms. So focusing on the benchmark land value, the two bases that have previously been accepted and are accepted are existing use value and alternative use value. The methodology or the approach not accepted is to use the market value or the price paid for land, and that's because if you adopt price paid because the developers overpaid for a site, this could effectively erode planning obligations, contributions, and drive up land prices, which creates a circular effect, and then land values continue to increase, but sort of policy obligations and contributions to things like affordable housing decline. So firstly, what's going under the proposed changes? So the one that never really got off the ground is the infrastructure levy, and in relation to that, the government said they feel the best way to achieve policy objectives is through the existing system of developer contributions, which means they're not implementing the infrastructure levy, which was introduced in the Levelling Up Regeneration Act 2023. It's not strictly sort of viability technically, but it's very closely related in terms of affordable housing delivery, and that's the requirement for 10% affordable home ownership, and also the requirement for mandatory first homes. Both have been proposed to be removed, and that's really it's offering welcome flexibility, I think, for authorities to prioritise the most needed tenures. It can be very different locations based on local housing need, and it can create sort of unhelpful trade-offs where there's too prescriptive an approach set at a national level.
So very much Tory initiatives, both of those things, weren't they?
Yeah, and I think just in practical terms, you have things like estate regeneration with returning households, sort of shoehorning in 10% home ownership can create real issues in terms of viability, but also just the kind of practicalities of those schemes. So what is now proposed on viability? Well, the underlying principles of establishing benchmark land values remain, and it's worth saying for the majority of sites, viability testing is intended to remain the same, and that's kind of reflected by the scrapping of the infrastructure levy. It's still going to be a detailed assessment which takes into account scheme specific characteristics at the planning application stage, but there are quite detailed proposals in relation to that release of greenbelt land, and there's proposed sort of golden rules related to the release of greenbelt land, which in a viability context means that there's an affordable housing target of 50%, which is subject to viability. We'll come on to that. It's the intention to maximise planning gain by putting a cap on benchmark land values. And in cases where the price paid for a site exceeds the benchmark land value cap, there'll be no viability test, and it's assumed the site can deliver 50% affordable housing. Whereas transacted below or at the benchmark land value, then developers will be able to propose less than 50% affordable housing, but the onus is on them to provide a financial viability assessment, and in all cases, a late stage review mechanism would be required, which is something we've grown very accustomed to in London, and it's kind of just a wider application of that on greenbelt sites. So how would this work in practice? I mean, beyond some of the core principles, I think there's some uncertainties around this in practice. It's still to be confirmed how benchmark land values will be calculated. I understand it's likely to be on the basis of sort of agricultural land, but not, you know, I think part of the consultation, there'll be some feedback that maybe there's some distinction between, a national, regional, or local level would be helpful to sort of make the process as accurate as it might be, even in a top-down methodology, and whether or not these benchmarks will be updated or how frequently they'll be updated. I think for this to work in practice at an academic level, you'd need benchmark land values to be somewhat dynamic and sensitive to market behaviour. There's this central tenet, I suppose, to viability, that it's calculated based on current day costs and values. So what will be interesting is how it's proposed to treat sites which have been purchased historically, whether there's like a settling in period where the old methodology applies, and where if they are going to update these benchmark land values, well, maybe if they change after a site's been acquired for development, how that's treated in this process. Good. So in terms of impact on the land market, I think, from a technical perspective, you can see two situations happening with sites. In a high value area where these sort of sites are capable of delivering 50%, I think we'll see a sort of competitive land market with sites transacting at what developers are able to pay, providing they can deliver 50%. But also we'll see a lot where offers are just in line with this market benchmark, because they know that that's the most they're able to pay, and that while still negotiating on planning obligations. So it kind of levels the playing field, but it raises some questions in terms of just the sort of competition process. Public disposals of land could be interesting with all prices at the same level. Whether or not there's going to be an impact on quality, with developers potentially looking at other areas of their appraisal to make up a margin on sites, and whether that's going to have an unintended consequence in terms of the quality of accommodation that is being delivered in these locations. And when talking about deliverability, I thought I'd just look at some of the sort of macro conditions. Obviously well documented and not something we need to spend too much time on, but looking at the residential sales market in particular, you see it's a fairly negative picture. After a period of growth, there was actually some deflation, and what we're looking at now, and I think for the next few years, it's like modest house price inflation. And in that context, the fairly recent significant cost inflation has had a real negative impact on viability. So we've got stabilized cost inflation, I think it's fair to say at the moment, but certainly not deflation, and we don't have values that are increasing at a rate to kind of offset the cost increases we've had in recent years. So with that noted, I think it's my expectation, and probably a lot of others, that a lot of these sites won't be able to meet the 50% requirement. Therefore, I expect a lot of them will be viability tested, which means that the land is likely to be capped at this sort of benchmark land value. And where the government lands in terms of calculating that benchmark land value, and I mean in terms of the agricultural value, but also the premium applied to those sites, that will be interesting to see if that is sufficient incentive to release land for development, and if it will have a material impact in the supply of development sites to deliver these numbers that we've that are making the headlines. I suspect, given slightly warped landowner expectations in some cases, that we might not see these sites coming forward in a lot of locations, because they'll hold out for a better price down the line. And it means we're relying on the slightly academic premium included in standardized benchmark land values to incentivize the release for development. So where that premium lands will be interesting, because it's a source of much debate in viability practice, between consultants. And I think it's possibly going to set some of the precedent for detailed assessments, not on greenbelt, but on viability testing of other types of sites, the conventional way. I think it's inevitably going to depend on wider government funding, and there's an additional 500 million committed in the autumn budget. Remains to be seen if that's enough. I think when you prorata it by unit, it actually doesn't sound like that much, but it would be good to see how this interacts with the viability testing process, and what we come onto in a bit, what we'd like to see. But I think a clear policy on the application of grant in viability tested schemes and developer-led schemes would go some way to giving some certainty on this. So from like a practitioner's perspective, I suppose there's definitely merit in removing a level of ambiguity over it's probably the most contentious element of viability. And that premium, for example, is an area where there's very rarely agreement between consultants during negotiation. And if you're to negotiate just on the other inputs, I think that would streamline the process, and you'd also be for something that is should be published in the public domain. If we're just talking about values and costs, those are terms that I think are more sort of understood for members of the public, and it sort of remove, perhaps it's going now anyway, but there's in the past that sort of connotation that viability is a bit of a dark art, and we're not sure what developers are doing to manipulate the numbers. So it would perhaps lend itself to a more kind of transparent and accountable process. I think, it's fair to say there's a level of mistrust between of developers, but also from developers of local planning authorities in terms of their approach as a negotiating tactic. Worth circling back and just noting that the majority of sites will be assessed under sort of the system that we know. So brownfield sites, it's the current viability methodology and set of guidance that you have to follow. But I suspect there's a school of policy thought that would like to see greater standardization when it comes to benchmark land value, and if there's success in this, then it could signal a bit of a movement on in kind of wider viability practice, even if it's frankly impossible to do on a site specific basis for all schemes because of the inherent complexities. I thought we would kind of wrap up on what we would like to see in light of the proposed changes, and that's like as an extension of those, or maybe like tweaks or just other things entirely. There are 54 people in, so that's great. And if I thought I'd just use this time to say if anyone's got any comments or things that they would like to see sort of related to this topic matter, and would very much welcome those. So just from my side, it's quite a well documented challenging market in terms of Section 106 affordable housing units at the moment, and there's been a lot of call for cascade mechanisms that would allow developers who are to some extent burdened with an affordable housing provision that they just don't have a buyer for, there's calls for mechanisms within Section 106 to allow that to be converted into a payment in lieu. And I think I have sympathy for that request, but really what we need first is some requirement to engage with registered providers throughout the planning process and in the early stages of delivery to ensure that what is coming forward on sites is fit for purpose and meets the brief of RPs. Notwithstanding that, I know that there are some locations and markets where there just isn't demand for any packages of affordable housing of a certain size. So a pragmatic look at how these legal agreements are structured would go some way to giving developers certainty that they're not going to be left with empty units at the end of the process. And as a bit of an extension of that, I think standardization of a payment in lieu calculation would be very helpful. There's no reason why that can't be applied nationally, because you're just talking about the difference in value of two things. And it's an area where we see like vastly different methodologies between local planning authorities. And then lastly, for me, it's a kind of explicit stance on the relationship between grant funding and viability. I mean, technically, Section 106 affordable housing delivered, through the planning process shouldn't attach grant, but there's all sorts of exceptional circumstances and kind of negotiated routes which do enable that in some cases. And I think a pragmatic look at the viability of these sites that are being released from the Greenbelt, for example, if we want to hit that 50% target, then a sort of pragmatic approach on grant subsidy would make that more sort of achievable than just allowing the market to kind of deliver that itself.
Yeah. And from myself, I mean, we certainly support the government's commitment to try and deliver 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years. And my couple of thoughts really stem from the sorts of challenges that we see day in, day out, doing the job that we do, primarily trying to deliver residential development on brownfield land. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the housing delivery test results show at the end of this year, reporting in terms of housing completions over the last financial year, because I think with what's happened with construction costs, the expectation is those results are going to look pretty bleak, and they're going to cause a lot of local authorities, including within Greater London, to show housing delivery test scores that are way below where they are supposed to be based on targets and objectively assessed need. And so one of the first challenge that we often find is that even where housing delivery or housing land supply is in a really poor position, local authorities, in my view, aren't giving that, or giving the delivery of homes, the thing that would remedy that problem, the sufficient weight that it ought to be given. So certainly we would like to see a stronger presumption in terms of the weight to be given to the delivery of homes, both private and affordable. And then secondly, even greater recognition that if we are going to hit this, these 1.5 million or these 80,000 new homes per year in London, clearly we're going to have to build at much higher densities than what we have been doing in the past. And what we can't do is, and what local authorities can't do, is say, well, sorry, you're building at, you're proposing 10 stories, but everything in this area is 2 and 3 stories. Well, sorry, if that location is very sustainably located, you're in a town centre, you're near a transport node, surely we need to be squeezing every last drop out of those sorts of sites, because we're just not going to have any chance of hitting those macro numbers if we don't do that. And all of those sorts of sites cumulatively add up, and play just as important a role in my view as these much larger strategic sites. So much more recognition that higher density is essential, I think would certainly benefit the industry.
Yeah, agreed. Do you think there's the impact on the number of schemes going to appeal is going to shift?
I certainly I mean, with all the noise that's coming out from the government at the moment, and we've certainly seen appeal decisions and that are coming through at the moment where it feels like the tide has turned or is turning, and it feels like there's been a direction to planning inspectors to say, well, look, you're a really important cog in this machine to deliver the homes we need, and so when you're interpreting the NPPF and local policy and in Greater London, the London Plan, you need to be putting more weight on the delivery of homes, and there needs to be an expectation of higher densities. And so I think naturally, as more of those decisions come through, which are the sorts of decisions which, in a positive sense, because they're appeals that are being allowed, and they're perhaps the sorts of decisions that we wouldn't expect to have received 6 months or a year ago, or further back. I think that's only going to embolden the industry and the development industry to use that appeal, channel. And certainly PINS has been very, very good recently at shortening the timeframes for appeals as well. I mean, both of us were involved in an inquiry earlier this year where it took only 6 months between the lodging of the appeal and conducting the inquiry and getting the receipt of the decision notice. 6 months, that would have been more than a year perhaps in the past. And so
2 schemes as well, wasn't it?
And it was 2 schemes as well. So certainly, we're having different conversations with clients now than we were having a year ago around the perhaps the benefits of the appeal channel that weren't there before.
Yeah, the trade-offs. And it does feel like there's almost like a momentum shift, as you say, with certain determinations coming through, and nothing's ever certain, but when there's like an increasing amount of precedent set for what I broadly call like pragmatic determinations on things like financial viability, in the interest of things coming forward. That's you can see how it sort of pushes applicants towards that route.
Absolutely.
We have questions. Sorry, I'm not that close to the device, but I'll lean forward. Some LPAs have already granted planning permissions that would meet their housing targets, but they're not being built out by developers/landowners who are looking to maximise their profit from the land. Government needs to look at ways in which we stop developers land banking. Well, I think, that's a really challenging thing to enforce. Firstly, I think, to rely on the private delivery of homes entirely does mean that we are, to an extent, beholden to the market. So we're beholden to developers and shareholders and profit margins. So to intervene to the extent of like forcing delivery on sites that aren't viable or even deliverable is a challenging thing. And I think sometimes there is a misconception in terms of, they own the site and they've got permission, therefore it's profitable, but they're holding out for like super profits. I think, appraising these developments on a day-to-day basis, we do see that a lot at the moment is very challenging to make stack. But I certainly take your point that the scale of delivery to meet the supply that's needed, that just won't come forward if we are completely reliant on developers, because why would you want to like saturate a market which you kind of need
It's paradoxical, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. To make your return, and you need your return to make the scheme come forward in the first place. But I think where we can influence supply, and parties who aren't beholden to shareholders and profit margins is through public delivery or sort of through the charitable registered provider bodies who have other objectives, and the main ways of encouraging that is through the level of funding that's available.
And I think we're certainly seeing, I would imagine you'd agree, there's a lot more local authorities are increasingly becoming active in the development.
Yeah.
As developers themselves, aren't they? And bringing more of that expertise in house and getting on and trying to plug that gap. I mean, authorities like Newham are very active, aren't they? Croydon historically have been quite active.
Yeah.
And it's just increasing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the model through which a lot of these local authorities are delivering is kind of changing or is varied. Actually, there was a trend of kind of purpose-built delivery vehicles being set up, and now some are actually bringing it back in-house because it wasn't the kind of arm's length efficient delivery vehicle that was envisaged. But yeah, there should always be an emphasis on local authorities, because in a market that's really challenging for developers who are out there buying land commercially, they have a bank of sites. I wouldn't say ready to go, but they don't have necessarily the same initial upfront cost, and so that means a lot of those sites in this market are more deliverable than others, and they're also quite an attractive proposition for partnership working, where you have developer contractors who can take a level of risk on sites, certainly, but not that upfront cash flow risk of acquiring a site. It's more in the delivery and the sales.
I mean, one of the interesting things that came out, in fact, through the previous government at the back end of their tenure, I think it was the announcements just before Christmas last year. There was a whole, possibly it was through that Planning and Infrastructure Act that came through, but they were talking about bringing forward a means by which developers who do land bank and don't get on and deliver planning permissions, that would somehow then be that would be a score against them the next time they come back with a planning application. And I mean, the whole thing was riddled with complexity.
Yeah, it's quite hard to implement, I suppose.
Very hard to implement, especially where you've lots of these sites are owned in special purpose vehicle companies as well, and how you control all that stuff. But I suppose it will be interesting to see, even though that was something that the Tory administration sought to bring through, it'll be interesting to see whether Labour feel like that's something they can run with as a principle, or sort of in some kind of guise.
Yeah, and relating that to your CPO point about the kind of the hope value attached to that, is it could be quite impactful in a negative way to landowners who are CPOs.
Yeah.
So maybe there's an incentive there, stick more than a carrot, to get on and do something. Yeah. Good. I don't think we have any more, but by all means jump in if you need. We've been going for sort of 50 minutes, so I think we'll give everyone. Oh no, we have one more. So I manage council house building projects for Ada and Worthing councils. We have to scale back because we're coming to the end of Homes England Affordable Housing Programme. Hopefully the government will announce an extension to the programme, or through housing deals through devolution. Yeah, I definitely echo that hope. I think, I mean, you were talking about the funds that have been allocated that haven't led to delivery in the current programme. I think certainly Homes England, but also in London, we had that extension to the 2016 to 21 programme that ran then on to 2023. And I think if there isn't an extension to the 21 to 26 program, there's going to be a lot of money that's unspent. So it would feel like the most practical thing. Otherwise, sometimes at the end of these programs, there's a bit of a mad rush to allocate the funding, and it ends up being utilized in probably not the most efficient way. Potentially just like to schemes which can offer additionality, but don't actually need that level of funding per unit to make sure it's spent really. And so an extension of the program timescales is a better way to improve the delivery of homes, I suppose, would be my point. Good, thank you. Okay, I think we're sort of just about there. So thanks everyone for joining. We had really good numbers, so that's very much appreciated. And thanks to those who asked questions. Luke, many thanks for joining. It was good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Look out for the next installment. I don't know exactly when that'll be, but our team here will be sort of publishing that and promoting it on LinkedIn and all the usual places. So thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.